Okay, folks, I guess we should begin. And I see that we're recording, so I think we're good to go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for this talk, which is part of the Visiting Artist Lecture Series hosted by the School of Art at the University of Arkansas. My name is Donal O'Donoghue. I'm an endowed professor of art education here in the School of Art. And tonight, it is my great pleasure and honor indeed to introduce our speaker, Professor Olivia Gude. Before I introduce Professor Gude, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the School of Art and the University of Arkansas are located on the ancestral lands of the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations. We're grateful for the opportunity to work and to learn and to live on these lands. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that this lecture series is made possible through the generous support of the Walton Family Foundation and the Joy Pratt Markham Visiting Lecture Endowment. So as I mentioned a moment ago, as we just got started, our speaker tonight is artist and educator, Professor Olivia Gude. Professor Gude serves as chair and professor of art education at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and she is also Professor Emerita of the University of Illinois at Chicago. In the field of art education, Professor Gude is widely known for her innovative work in the areas of curriculum theory and curriculum making. She describes her work as a practice that is committed to generating new projects and new paradigms for art education in school and community settings. In that work, Professor Gude draws from her experience as a former art teacher, a teaching artist, as well as a community artist. And her work as a teacher, as a scholar, as an artist and writer in our field, in the field of art education, has inspired and influenced generations of art educators, shaping how they bring young people and others into the company of artworks. In recognition of her significant contributions to the field of art education, in 2009, the National Art Education Association awarded Professor Gude the Viktor Lowenfeld Award, and 5 years later, she was the recipient of the Manuel Barkan Award. And in 2019, Professor Gude was elected as a Distinguished Fellow of the National Art Education Association. As an artist, Professor Gude is one of the founding members of the Chicago Public Art Group, and she's created more than 50 mural and mosaic projects nationwide. And when I was preparing these opening remarks, one thing that I remembered was that one of the first presentations I heard Professor Gude give back in 2006 at the International Society for Education Through Art World Congress in Viseu in Portugal. And at that presentation, she shared an account of her community-based art practice and the artworks that she created in Chicago and elsewhere, with a particular focus on their educational potentiality. For me, I've always found that Professor Gude has lived between the space of education and the space of art, and has bridged that space quite beautifully. So tonight, we're very fortunate that she has agreed to come and to speak with us. The title of Professor Gude's lecture tonight is Psychoaesthetic Geography, Collaborative Public Art. And I should stop and ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Olivia Gude. So I'm going to pass it over to Olivia, and whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you, Donal. I appreciate that lovely introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to kind of get that going. Yeah. So, let's see. Yes. And I think I'm just going to, yeah. Good. All right. So thank you so much for having me. You could just sort of start with some close-ups of mosaics, and then this will all maybe make sense when we get to some of these things in a little bit. So I begin with the term psychogeography. And psychogeography is a term coined by the Situationist International, an avant-garde international European group, began in 1957 and closed in 1972. And the term was invented to describe the psychological impact of a geographical location on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So in sort of different aspects of my life, one, getting an MFA from the University of Chicago and engaging in that study of like avant-garde contemporary art practices. And then another aspect of my art education was being introduced to the Chicago mural movement by elders in Chicago, some of whom were the people who organized the first Wall of Respect. And when I came across this term psychogeography, I was so struck by it because it really seemed to sum up some of the thoughts that I had about what does it mean? How does a community mural work to have a psychological impact on people? So in a sense, it becomes this aesthetics of geography. How do you revisualize a space? How do you add to a space in a way which is both sensitive to the space, but also transforms the space? And so this idea of psychoaesthetic geography, that's like the mission of collaborative public art. So I'm just going to go through, these are not in chronological order, they're just sort of in various orders, but I think it will maybe make sense to you as an unfolding narrative. I realized just a minute here that, yeah, okay. I just was looking at my timer. So this is a mural that I did back in 1987 in Madison, Wisconsin. And this was on a food co-op. And the food co-op was a radical food co-op that was actually known for thinking about the ideas of food and justice. And so this mural was made, and you can see sort of there's the mural, but this is what you kind of go through to make the mural, including here's like this collage together space where various people have worked on designing, and we've drawn various things, changed the scale, brought the mural together. And then here we have it, the mural being worked on. Yeah. So I'm just kind of moving through this because part of it is that, these murals, when they're on the street, they have to stand for themselves. They have to be able to represent their meaning to themselves. Sorry, I was just having trouble getting started here. So basically this mural talks about the idea of what is the role of food distribution? Is it about money, or is it about the idea of providing healthful food to a community? And talking about sort of this notion of this cycle of life, the regenerative cycle of life, including there's all sorts of little details in a mural like this, such as the detail that the earth becomes very crispy and hard every winter. And then there's the quality of making that begin to break and open up. Now, when we were working on this, we would actually drive, Madison, Wisconsin is not too far from Chicago, like a couple hundred miles. And we would drive up to Madison, Wisconsin, my partner, John Pounds, and I, who was my collaborator on this mural. And one of the things that we would do is we'd have potluck suppers, and we'd have different events as we drew people together to think about what was important to them to represent in the meaning of the mural. And this was back in 1987, right? So, and people were talking about the importance of bulk food. And I remember us kind of thinking like, bulk food, really? And we would just kind of forget to develop images related to that. But then people kept saying, well, this is really important. And when we actually finally did these images and this became part of the mural, what was so important for us was this recognition when we actually lived in Madison and were shopping at this co-op, as I say, this was many years ago, recognizing by being at a co-op, which did not have, that had a lot of food that was not prepackaged, how much waste there was. And of course, this is something that's become so much part of our thinking about food distribution nowadays for many people. And there were many different, so a mural like this has many different ideas in it. And the notion is it's made for the community and that people learn from and contribute to the mural as it's being made. Like in this banana here, this co-op actually had a banana tax that specifically raised money to support solidarity organizations in Central America, where most of the US bananas come from. Now, if you look at this mural here, you can kind of say, you know, where is the scene here? It's just a very tiny part of the mural. And one of the things is kind of, this mural actually was, this co-op was well known for being part of the anti-war movement in the 1970s against the Vietnam War. And there was a lot of activism that happened, you know, around this co-op, including there was this dancing bomb, Solidarity Forever, that was actually originally on the wall where the mural was painted. And people wanted to talk about how do we represent that? And yet it actually raised something which I know has been a recurring issue that I've dealt with making murals, and I think all muralists deal with. On one hand, one wants to be honest, and you don't want to, you know, just have things like happy people. On the other hand, you also don't want to have a piece of art that kind of drags people down emotionally each day. And so one of the decisions in this case was that it would be important to have this idea about the co-op's recognition of the importance of passive resistance, but also of confrontations with police. And so here's the police arresting broccoli was one of the images that people came up with. And then the dancing people, they always had a big street party, a May Day there. And here, like, is a kind of an example to think about what happens when you get lots of people involved in painting a mural. Now, I usually try to challenge people, like, can you find this image on this big picture? And it's there way on the right-hand side in that little kind of cul-de-sac right there that you can see. And what happens when we did this is that one person was really interested in this idea, and we let one of the volunteers just do the work of creating the path and the little flowers and the windows and all these things. Now, as a muralist, you might have just made a few strokes and kind of suggested this form scene. But the idea is that with a collaborative mural, what you can do is have lots of people contribute different images and ideas to the mural, so that when you look at the mural, it's not so much about the fact that there's only one hand, one design in the mural, but there's many different hands that show in the mural, and that becomes part of the meaning of the work. So before I started doing actually big public murals, I actually was doing street installations. So this is a piece called Unemployment Line Forms that referred to the really bad depression that was happening in the United States in the 1980s. And so in this mural, what we have is we actually went to unemployment lines and interviewed people and asked them how being unemployed had changed their perceptions of reality. And so when we made the mural, we made it by stencil. We, took photographs and made stencils of people in the unemployment line, and then we airbrushed the people onto the sidewalk. And the reason we used an airbrush instead of spray paint is we knew that we would surely get arrested if we were caught spray painting the sidewalk. But when you're airbrushing the sidewalk, it's a little bit more confusing. Like, why are you airbrushing the sidewalk? And this piece was done across from a gallery that was having a show about artists responding to the Great Depression of the 80s. And the text in the piece is based on interviews with people in these unemployment line forms, transcribing what they said exactly, and then editing through transcripts to find just exactly those words, which in this sort of everyday poetry explain what's happening. Like, I always remember one woman saying, "It'll all boil down to an uproar." Or someone saying, this is the afterlife, but this is the life, but what will be the afterlife when my unemployment runs out and I keep living? And so the idea of this was to kind of insert into this public conversation the sort of a look at the meaning of unemployment in people's lives. And you can see here, this is a few, days later, a couple of weeks later, that as people walk, some of the words get blurred out. The figures remain crisp, but some of the words get blurred out and sort of disappear. And then when there was like a really driving rainstorm, finally, the words disappear, but the people are still there. And, that was so indicative of the fact that the way unemployment is calculated, after you've been unemployed for a certain number of months, like, a year, you fall off the unemployment rolls. And so people who actually are chronically not being able to get employment disappear. And that was one of the meanings of this piece. Now, the other thing, though, was around the same time, I was actually a high school teacher. And I put this in because sometimes like artists will be like, oh, I don't want to talk about being a high school teacher. I want to talk about out on the street, being a non-permission artist, or out on the street painting murals. But I think this has been an important part of my work, which is learning to think through certain kinds of ideas with students and learning to work with students collaboratively. So this is a piece, I'll just show you a few of these mini projects that I did with the students called Heartbreak High School. And the idea was, you've lived the life, now see the mural. So as we tried to find ideas for themes, one of the things that came up was, at some point, one of the students started saying, really, we talk about school all the time, but what everybody's really interested in is romance. And so we made this mural, and here you can see like a collaborative, part of the design being collaged together from the drawings of many students. And then the mural becomes a story about that the real content of high school is the romance and the breakups and the things that are happening. So here's like the graduating angels who are being torn apart. And so this idea of like kind of this sort of taxonomy, actually we talked about it as a Roland Barthes of high school love, of his lover's discourse, where it was like looking at, sort of the tropes of love that show up in actual high school, but also in the representations of high school in movies and novels and TV shows. Now, around the same time, this was actually 1984, and we did a mural called 1984. And of course, already in 1984, the book 1984 had been taught for years in a lot of high school curriculum. And so we decided that this mural would investigate the similarities and differences between the actual 1984 and the 1984 predicted in the novel. One of the things that we noticed that in 1984, there's this black and white TV everywhere. And, there's this sort of grim big brother who is telling people what to think, what to do. And what students actually kind of commented on was how in the real 1984, the TVs are in color and there's a lot of like control of what you're thinking and where your attention is directed, but it's not by this grim figure, but it's by all these different kind of crazy things that like Michael Jackson's hair caught on fire that year, or the Cabbage Patch Dolls, or all sorts of things like that. So the idea was that it was like we were all sort of mesmerized by this sort of media fantasy. And of course, this was, many years ago. It's even more so now, but this holds our attention. And at the same time, all these things hold our attention. Up at the top, you see, this Peter's map of the world, and pointing at it are all these nuclear warheads, which were, 1984, there was a lot of discussion around this idea of if it would be possible to step away from sort of this brink of nuclear war that the world had been on for many years. And this was kind of a controversial image. And I remember we were talking with the students, and at one point we were kind of saying, why is it controversial to make a picture of what everyone knows is true? And actually that was something that has really struck me at the moment, and it's stuck with me for years, which is that in our work as artists, to make a picture of things that are true can be very controversial. And that, in a sense, is one of the strengths of being an artist. Now, in this particular mural, we also, across from the mural, the wall is painted black, and all these students are just sitting there staring. Excuse me. Now, the sides of the mural have all these sort of silhouettes and these figures standing. And that was meant to represent those things were traced from Defense Department magazines, US Defense Department magazines in our library, and, kind of talked about the military buildup from, the point of view of this is our job, this is the military. And what we talked about was in the book 1984, what's happening in the society is always controlled by the fact that there are wars on the borders. You never go to the war, you never see it, but those wars really do affect what's happening in the society. And that was exactly the case in 1984, when there was this huge military expenditures and buildup that eventually actually led to the fall of the Soviet Union, because they couldn't keep up with it. So whatever the outcome was, there was a sense that there was a real reduction in spending for schools and for healthcare because of this sort of framing of our lives in military expenditures. Excuse me. So as I was doing a number of these murals in the school, at one point, the principal kept trying to get me to do an auditorium mural, you know, like, okay, you do that mural where you paint the men's basketball team really big. And I would always avoid doing that because I really didn't want to be, you know, doing the auditorium mural. And finally, it was just kind of like, okay, I will do the auditorium mural. So this is like the, you know, scene looking into the auditorium. But what was a big surprise, I mean, not a surprise to the students who were involved, not a surprise to many of the other sports that were involved, but instead of just focusing on the men's basketball team, we actually focused on all the teams in the school, including, you know, here's the women's basketball team, or the volleyball people, or the, you know, the soccer people, or the wrestlers. And what was really fascinating about this is that actually, like, the varsity basketball, men's basketball, were kind of mad because they felt we had like not done what we were supposed to do, because obviously, you know, any kind of mural down in the PE area should really focus on these, you know, varsity men's sports. And instead, what we chose to do was to honor all these sports and all these young people with all different kinds of body types. And it was extremely popular with all these different coaches, because for once, they were not just put to the side, but they were equally valued with others. And so I look at this mural and I think about it in terms of that as muralists, as community murals, as collaborative muralists, our job is always to go to a site and to say, what's happening here and how might we think of it differently because of what we have investigated, what we have done, what we have thought. And as I say, in this case, I thought it was really interesting that we came up with this idea of valuing, you know, all these different physical types and all these ways of being. Now, as part of my work as an art educator, one of the things that I sort of developed around this time was thinking about what you could sort of say is, what are some of the things that will happen because people participate in a community mural? And some of the things are the participants will understand the ways in which the spaces they inhabit shape the intellect and spirit of human beings. The participants will recognize that places in the 21st century are created, preserved, or manufactured by human choice and effort. The participants will engage in altering and recreating the human psyche by individually and collaboratively altering and recreating spaces within their everyday lives. And, you know, reflecting on these things, writing out these, you know, these proposed learning outcomes, one of the things that I started to recognize is how important it is for us as part of our work in the visual arts to really expand our notions of what we make from just things that pictures that hang on a wall or sculptures that are in a space to actually creating the spaces themselves. Some years later, I was on the National Core Arts Standards writing team for the visual arts, and we developed this enduring understanding. People create and interact with objects, places, and design that define, shape, enhance, and empower their lives. And that is now an enduring understanding in the National Visual Arts, and there's a whole set of standards that go with this. I actually would like to note, since I'm here now, that the idea for that sequence of define, shape, enhance, and it was enable, I think, when Donald wrote it, this was actually from a phrase that Donald wrote to describe a book that colleagues of ours, Paul Boland and Doug Blandy did. And when I saw those words, I thought those are so perfect. And I wrote to Donald and said, can we use that sentence as the core for an enduring understanding? And he said, yes. So I'm really pleased that that became part of sort of a mandate for teachers. But also I would say, you know, these visual arts standards are also used by museums and by community arts organizations. So it's really a way to sort of, you know, look at the importance of our work in defining and shaping life. Here's a project called How Are You Called From Home, which was actually a colloquialism in Southern Illinois for what were you called, what was your maiden name? You know, what was your name before you were married? And so this piece was done and designed and made with 4th graders, 8th graders, high schools, and adults at the Valmeyer Community Library, which is in Southern Illinois. Well, you guys aren't that far away. It's just across the river, basically, from St. Louis. And so here's some, it's in the community library, and it is, you know, it kind of talks about sort of the history, and it kind of collects all these artifacts and sort of weaves this history of the time. Here's one of the teachers who's using a photograph of her husband's family farm to create that image in the mural. This town actually had a terrible flood. And this was the school, high school. And what you see here, this was the height that the waters of the flood actually happened at the 50-year flood in the 40s. We were painting this in the 90s. And actually, shortly after we painted this mural, there was another 50-year flood. Here you can see some of the formal sketches that the students were doing. This is our collection room where people brought in photographs and images and artifacts that we used as we were collectively doing the history. This was a section painted by the 4th graders, and they this was actually based on a photo of a one-room schoolhouse in the area. The 4th graders put themselves in the clothes of children who were photographed around that time, and then at the turn of the century, and then they did portraits of themselves. Here you can see in this picture, there's a church and a tavern. And there was a saying in that part of the country, all you need to have a town is a church and a tavern. So one of the things that also happens in this mural, as you look at it, the seasons change as you go through it. And you can kind of see the bluffs here. So this town is like nestled right along the Mississippi River, and some of it's on the bluffs of the river. And this is, again, the area, some of you may have heard of Cahokia Mounds, a sort of lost Indian civilization, indigenous people who we do not know why they left this area. And this is an example of some of the kinds of things that were found. And then we also had other artifacts that were brought in, like the calling cards high school kids used to have, or you know, the family marriage photographs, or skeleton keys, and people talking about how basically there was a time when you could use the same key for every door in town because no one had like fancy locks. If they locked it all, it was with, you know, a skeleton key. And here you see the Maidstown wave. So people are waving. And this was this idea that when you pass someone on the road anywhere around here, this is very kind of hilly country, like actually around like where Bentonville is, you know, it's like continuation of the same landforms, that people, when they pass each other, would always wave, because even if you didn't identify someone right away, you sort of assumed that you knew the people. And part of this was, so too, this idea that these people are leaving, and they're leaving because it's very difficult to stay in a small town and make a living. And so part of this notion of community in small towns is always this sense of loss of the people who have left and still are connected in some ways. And this is a very interesting image here. This was the town of Valmeyer, and this is actually a portrait of Joseph Valmeyer, who was, I think, a great grandson of one of the founders of Valmeyer. But in this other little picture here, what you see is people are beating up this farmer. This is a town that was actually a mostly German-speaking town, and for many years there was a sermon that was preached in the Lutheran Church and in the Catholic Church in German. There's a lot of things like card games that would go back to like Germany, a lot of preservation of German heritage from a lot of people who basically came in the 1840s to this area. But now they're talking about how in World War II, World War I, and then again in World War II. But in World War I, basically vigilante groups would come and harass the German farmers and make them buy savings bonds that they really couldn't afford, because they were saying, you have to prove that you're really an American. And so it was this really interesting thing that we got into some deep conversations about in the community, about the idea that the fact that sometimes the US can be so anti-bilingual may have something to do with the fact that many people in the US have, German origins, and that many German people felt that they had to give up speaking German in order to prove that they were real Americans at World War I and then again at World War II. And I know that that's part of the story of my own family over in St. Louis. And so it made us really think a lot about the fact that, this is a time when the whole concept of multiculturalism, more and more people are talking about this, but that there was a time when these German people were perceived as other, and their interest in preserving their own culture was perceived as suspect. And I think that created a very kind of deep understanding about what does it mean to exist in American culture. So here you can see us working on the mural. Yeah. So similarly, not too different time, I was working in the Chicago area, and this is a mural called By All Means Necessary. And the idea was, we actually did this mural, we designed it and painted it in 6 weeks. And that was kind of the plan. And what we knew is, if we're gonna do that, we have to limit something if it's gonna be big and good. And so we decided to really focus on the idea of the black and white graphic quality of it. And so the notion of the mural was that what do we need? What are the means that are necessary in order to create a successful and prosperous life in African-American communities? And one of the images that was pretty intense as we were talking about it was this idea of someone with a suit, someone with money, who's handing guns into the community, which is causing all, and that, these young men are shooting each other. And then at some point when they kind of pull off their blindfolds, they're like, we're shooting ourselves. And they kind of, how can we rethink this? What are the means that we might find to get away from this? And sadly, this mural was painted years ago, but it's still a very significant issue in people's lives. And one of the early feeds in the mural, and I could go on forever about any one of these with all these sort of different crazy things, but the idea is that people are planting a seed, and then people come together. That's from the beginning of the mural, and they come together with sort of their water of their life energy and pour it on this tree, which then grows. And so all these different leaves, and ones that aren't even in this picture, there was a number of youth on this site, not just on our mural team, but doing other projects, and everyone got to design a symbol that could be put into this tree of life. Again, around the same time, this is a series, I did a series of collaborations with spray can artists. One of the things that happened in Chicago, I think that was really interesting, is that we decided that there was this sort of connection between embracing public space, of the spray can artists and of the muralists. Now, in some cities, there'd be these kind of wars between muralists and spray can artists. And we always had worked to not have that happen by doing various collaborative projects. So Design, he was this really well-known spray can artist, and now is actually a very well-known artist. He and I teamed up to do some murals. So this is Still Deferred, Still Dreaming, that was done on the 30th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And so throughout the mural are quotes about the idea of the dream and what it means in African-American life. And I know this is being recorded, by the way, and put into your library. So if there's some details that you might want to look at, you might be able to go back to that. This is one of the quotes in our research that we came up with that we found really meaningful. What do you pack when you pursue a dream, and what do you leave behind? And I think that's something that many of us think about, maybe especially people who are first-generation college students. What does it mean to transform yourself, and what do you have to leave, and what do you gain when you do that? And so if you can see, there's little people walking throughout. These were children. This mural was done with a team of high school students. And then the children who go to this Boys and Girls Club Center made little marching civil rights figures that we turned into stencils so they could be put into the mural. Another mural we did with that same group of people, done in conjunction with the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, a few miles away. is called Aren't I a Women? We've been asked by the Puerto Rican Cultural Center to do a piece that was a tribute to third world women, to Puerto Rican, Mexican, and American women. But what we said was, we don't really want to make a mural which just basically makes these beautiful women so that we're looking at them in the same way that people look at advertisements. So instead, we decided to make the eyes of the women looking back at the people. And here's a bunch of the kids who were involved in this. And, you know, also some of the students really were excited to learn to do like spray kind of work, and the local football kids were coming over and say, wow, this is so interesting. So, you know, part of doing this kind of project is always the energy that comes from having people see and be involved in what's happening. And so that was the year actually when people started wearing those colored contacts in their eyes. Right around that time, we kind of at some point looked at all of us and we said, you know, we're all brown-eyed people. Like, why are people putting in these fake plastic blue contact lenses in their eyes? And so, you know, that became one of the images of the piece. And we were doing that using poetry by this wonderful Puerto Rican poet, Julio de Burgos, you know, who talks about this idea of like the natural, vital beauty of a woman. You curl your hair and paint your face, not I am curled by the wind and painted by the sun. And so Aren't I a Women is actually something that Sojourner Truth said. And then we also have quotes from Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was considered to be one of the greatest poets of the Spanish language, a Mexican woman. And this is an English translation of one of her poems. There in Egypt, all the sages were convinced that gender is not of essence in matters of intelligence. So this is on a school. So you can kind of see like how this was a kind of an important idea for the students to represent the notion of gender as being not, these are these beautiful women, but these are these empowered women who are looking and who are thinking and making. Okay, so, you know, a few years later, now we're back out we're in the rural area in Illinois, DeKalb, where Northern Illinois University is. Some of you may know that. And actually, one of the things you can see in terms of my work as a community artist and muralist, that I've done a lot of work in rural areas as well as, you know, being myself, you know, live in an urban area, and I'm very involved in urban areas. And I've been really interested for many years in this idea of how, oh, wow. When I think about that in terms of now, it's kind of intense, but, you know, of how there's this sort of divide set up between people in urban areas and rural areas. And to me, there just seems to be so much commonality in terms of what engaged people live with and deal with and make happen in their lives in neighborhoods and in rural communities. So this piece is in DeKalb, Illinois, and it was sponsored by NIU Museum. And this is, by the way, this is terrible giving talks like this where I can't see you. Like, I thought this was going to be a Zoom call so I could at least see a few of you on the edges. But I always sort of say to people, what makes it hard to make a mural on this particular wall? And of course, people are like, where the heck are you going to make a mural? There's all these windows everywhere, you know? And so that was kind of like, yeah, how do we deal with this? And I hope you'll be kind of interested in the solution we came up with, because I think when you first look at this wall, you don't think, oh my gosh, look at all those windows. So what we did was find that one place where we could put a 50-foot tall cornstalk on the wall, because actually this was DeKalb is the place where some of you may have seen like these cornfields that are marked with like flying ears of corn. That was like DeKalb Ag. And this was also actually the place where the first farm bureau in the United States was. So again, we go through this process of collecting ideas. How do people bring ideas to us? And what was really interesting in this particular community was that a lot of people brought us postcards. We'd go interview different key people, and they would take out these old postcards and say, hey, look at this, look at this. So here you can see the mural that's been designed, and people oftentimes are interested to see this. to make the mural, what I often do is to do projection, just because it's a much quicker way of putting something on the wall than either freehand drawing and having to get down and keep checking, or to do a grid, which is very time consuming. And in this particular case, what was tricky, and a really important part of what makes this mural work visually, it's actually painted where there's all this raw brick showing. And that was, both a practical choice, like we didn't have to cover the whole wall, but it was actually a design choice, because since this is the last building on the row of buildings in downtown DeKalb, it seemed like it would sort of dematerialize the wall and make the whole town seem like a Disneyland if we destroyed the physical solidity of that wall. So, yeah, so here you can see us, we are at night, and what we're doing is we're projecting onto the wall, we're painting the primer into the areas, and then because it was, hot as hell, and in like, beginning of July, as soon as we painted that primer on the wall, it just dried, and then we could go ahead and use our paintbrushes to do the line drawing on the wall. And here you can see people getting involved in all sorts of things. This one particular postcard we altered to add the husky, which is an NIU symbol. And the mural is kind of made up of these ideas of these old postcards, which represent different buildings in DeKalb, and then lower down so that you can actually read it, is there's all these texts that deal with the fate of these buildings. Like some of them have already been destroyed. Some of them might be destroyed or might be restored. Some of them have been restored. This actually, one of the interesting things about this town was that it was founded on barbed wire money. And so that became, part of the meaning of the piece. What does it mean to have barbed wire, which literally changed the history of the world in terms of like World War I warfare, but it also in terms of enclosing land in the West. This is also, so I'm not talking about every image, but what you can kind of see, this is the underpainting that then becomes the painting. Annie Glidden was the niece of one of the barbed wire barons and was very much involved in the town of DeKalb. And one of the things that we have is that Annie stands next to this giant stalk of corn, and it's kind of like this Midwestern surrealism, which is this idea, like how did she represent a Midwestern character? And we collected, there were still a lot of people around who actually had known Annie Glidden. She had been gone and she'd been passed away for many years, but she was one of the first people I ever heard of who went to ag school. The idea that just a regular person decided, I'm going to go back to college and go to ag school. She didn't contribute a lot of money, but she contributed her time and ideas. Some people thought Annie was crazy, but I think she just did what she wanted to. And her dress, by the way, is a pattern that was made. You saw someone earlier, I was working with one of the older women on the project, and the pattern is a pattern made up of corn and barbed wire, which was the economic base. And then here's actually a historical impersonator being Annie Glidden, dressed up in the Annie Glidden outfit that we sort of imagined for her. Another kind of interesting part of this mural is there's all these little pictures that were drawn from yearbooks. And we were dealing with this idea that I mentioned earlier, which is that the community of small towns is also the people who have left the town. So these are portraits of DeKalb High School and NIU students scattered throughout this mural who represent the extended community of DeKalb, the people who live here now, as well as those who were raised here or studied here and who remain connected to the spirit of this place. And so kind of throughout the mural floats all these people who are these representations of the sort of extended community of DeKalb. So I'm going to kind of go through looking at my time here. We're in the city, and it's between two neighborhoods, a mostly Black and a mostly white neighborhood. By the way, this is the neighborhood that Barack Obama was a community organizer, and actually around the same time that we actually overlapped with him. And here you can see the dedication day of this mural. The mural is called I Welcome Myself to a New Place Where All the People Can Join on In. And the idea of this mural was to look at the fact that there had been all these like Rosalind Pullman organizations, but that collaboration had waned as Roseland had become a mostly African-American neighborhood, and there was this divide. And so the idea was to create a mural where we met on this divide and created a mural together. So a lot of my work has actually dealt with the idea of race. So here's another project a few years later called Where We Come From, Where We're Going. And this was based on interviews of people. So I literally stood on the corner and asked people, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And in a sense, I was asking myself the question, just because people are, it's an interracial community, an interracial neighborhood. Is it an interracial community? Are people really in dialogue with each other? And so those, in a sense, were some of the underlying themes that emerge in this question, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And so in a way, it's like standing at the train station here and hearing people speak, like hearing their ideas. And people are reflecting on different things about, I feel so much joy living here. I'm in this neighborhood because I'm going to the seminary. And then this other woman, the redheaded woman, is saying like, I hate this neighborhood. It's so depressing. I want to be downtown. She left actually when she graduated and got her PhD in economics and worked for the World Bank. People talking about just sort of the different aspects of their lives. So again, this is again a few years later, and it again addresses this theme about race and difference. And this mural is called Fellows and Others, and it's painted on Fellowship House, which was a boys and girls club, in the Chicago area. But we kind of were struck by this idea of Fellowship House. It's just kind of a funny old retro name. And again, here you can see this mural also had the issue of lots of windows. And how do we figure out how to make a mural work, and have us not be like dominated by the architecture, but to work with the architecture. So the kind of theme of this was consider a fellow, one of us, kind, clean, and considerate. And then what do you think about somebody who you've decided as an other? Are they always unkind, unclean, always inconsiderate? So this project began, like a lot of projects that I do, actually, I do a colored undercoating for those of you who are thinking about doing murals. Basically, you take 5 gallons of gesso and you can throw in a quart or 2 of phthalocyanine blue, and you'll get this really intense blue, which makes for a really beautiful underpainting for a mural. Now, this was the mural that was there, and I always kind of show this to remind people, don't go to a neighborhood and paint a mural that you would not want across the street from your house, I can say that I live in this neighborhood now. Actually, when I started, I lived not too far from here, but when I actually did this mural, I really fell in love with this neighborhood and have been living here now for many years. But, somebody just came quickly, they did this project. And I remember the kids who go to the center here saying, why all these animals? Do they think we're animals? So, really think through, what does it mean when you take a wall? What is your responsibility? So these are some designs done with kids where they're thinking about how might we start to make use of this space. And you can kind of see some of the ideas there end up really helping us to imagine the formal qualities of the space. So here's some pictures just as this is starting to get painted. And a few of the things that you see, there was actually a racial incident where some teens beat up a African-American child, and a few months before we did this mural. And so the students had a demonstration, Erase the Hate, and that's represented in this mural. But we also asked these questions. Why do people pick a person to pick on? Why do people pick a people to pick on? Like, where does this notion of racism happen? So one of the things that we did for this mural is we did what we called these people, those people studies. And so it would be like, those people steal to get money. These people are willing to work hard. Those people should be locked up forever. These people just need a second chance. And so one of the things that we tried to look at is how people set up these ideas about people without knowing people. They make these connections. And this was actually an African-American woman who worked in the center saying, did you ever hear someone say, you're okay, we're okay, but watch out for those other people, who are maybe of the same race as the person they're talking to? How people have this way of othering people. So these were some of the work we did with middle school and high school and adults, where we came up with these sort of these people, those people things, like, those people have junky cars. These people keep their cars nice. And those people these people take care of their homes. Those people don't. So this idea of constantly setting up these stereotypes. So here's the thing, the kids we were working with on this project and the teenagers were basically African-American, Mexican-Americans, and Puerto Rican-American kids and a few white kids. This neighborhood also has a growing population of Chinese people. So one of the kids had made this thing, those people eat weird foods, maybe even cats and dogs, whereas these people eat tasty, normal food. And I remember saying, and the kids were like, yeah, that's true. I'm like, kids, we've just had this whole conversation. You've done all this work around the idea of othering people. And then here you are making up those Chinese people eat cats, And it was a really interesting moment where I think all of us sort of reflected on how it is really difficult to root out these people, those people narratives that play in our minds. So the idea was that you have these racism blocks and they go on a conveyor belt and they end up getting put into this head. And instead of actually seeing the people, you project onto them, either fellow or other. Some of the other work we did with the teenagers was a self-concept study, things adults in the neighborhood have said to me. And, I have to say, I had taught for many years. When we made this whole set of pieces of the kids talking about things that adults have said to them, I actually was in tears. I think a lot of us were in tears because this idea of what does it mean to be a young person of color who is just bombarded with this negative language. And then the students telling us that the police would say, this was actually also, it's a Boys and Girls Club, but it's also the front facing of a housing project. And that the police would say to them, and one of the kids was saying, when people find out you live in public housing, they treat you like an other. Or the police would say to them, go back to where you belong, as though you didn't have the right to be in the community. We also got into these conversations about one of the kind of othering that happens is being checked for lice in your hair. And the kids are like, why would they think we have lice? But every once in a while, when they go to the community center, they have to have their heads searched. And we talked just about these ideas about who gets made into an other. And one of the images is these one-eyed, one-armed aliens who just cannot figure out why these people on Earth are either confronting each other or ignoring each other. Like, why are they behaving this way? And then a little bit later down in the mural, you see the answer, which is that we have been trained very often to see things in black and white, to see those value contrasts and to let that form the values of our lives. So now I'm just going to switch it up a little bit and say, I also started to do mosaics. And so you can see, here's some work on a mosaic that I love doing these mosaics because they frame the doorways of schools and they fit on these old buildings and they just look so right to be there, that a school shouldn't be plain. It should have something which is really beautiful to inspire kids as they walk in. And this particular piece was the first one where I used sort of a design feature that I've been using, which is to create the text, the words, take the words of a text, but to do it out of like collage from magazines. So like when you cut out the letters, And so there's this idea of this sort of collage together, ephemeral, popular cultural stuff that makes important statements and that it makes it in a medium that lasts and lasts for, potentially hundreds of years. So this mural is actually, this is a mosaic project I did in Covington, Kentucky. And we ended up having our saying be, we're making the front porch of Covington a place for community conversation. We chose words which will stimulate thought and encourage conversation. So the idea was to make these mosaic seating grouping so that, and the pieces are specifically put together close enough that if you sit on them and someone else sits on one, you're going to be kind of close to that person. So then you're going to end up starting to talk to them. So we recruited all these people. We had community sessions in different neighborhoods around Covington. And like a lot of times when you do community design, you're making these lists. And one of the interesting things he did, because we were bringing stuff together from neighborhoods all over the city, was then we would cut these lists up and start to intersperse them with our core design group. Here you can see some neighborhood residents participating. And what was a really interesting part of this project, which is that it focused on the vernacular architecture of Covington. So it began with fourth graders in a summer program, and then they made all these little houses. And luckily they had just learned about graphing and stuff. And they made all these sort of representations of important, not of important buildings, of significant sort of architectural styles of the everyday life of Covington. And then the summer program was over, plus it would be very difficult for fourth graders to have the precision of painting these things. And so the Dixie porcelain painters came to our rescue, and they became part of the project, both in doing the glazing, but then many of them stayed on to create buildings, of their own memories of the town that became part of it. So then all these houses that we made became part of these different scenes of Covington throughout the seasons. And we created texts that were based on the work that we did talking together. We also had to teach people to do mosaics, which is a little tricky. And so you can see here, we're actually doing it in paper first so that people can kind of learn the idea of the tile fitting. Being an educator, it used to kind of be like people were thinking, you can do that kind of crack tile mosaic with regular folks, but it's really hard for people to do this sort of perfectly fit mosaics. And then I realized, being an educator, there's two problems going on. One is, how do you cut glass? And then two, how do you decide what shape you want? So we started to separate those out. Here you can see some of the sample pieces that were made. And then here we are working on the mosaic. These are like pictures of all the people who've come into the studio. We had an old hardware store that had just closed, and we used that as our space. And one of the things that was really exciting was bringing all these different people from Covington together in the space, and people sharing plants and candy and baked goods, and just being really involved in this community. And for me, it was such an important thing, because it made me realize, you think it's not possible to get people to stop looking at the spectacle of the media spectacle of the world that we live in. But actually, it occurred to me doing this project, maybe all we need to do is to create sites where interesting things can happen and people will come. And that was certainly our experience. So here's some of these pieces that were worked out, making collages of the important phrases that people came up with. And then these are worked here in Mosaic. This was, why just sit? Be willing to work. Like someone was talking about, hey, I'm out here doing this community volunteer stuff. Why are you just looking at me? Come on in and do it too. And then this question about, how will we grow? What we realized is that none of us can know the answer to this question, because growth is a process, often with surprising results. So you can't decide what kind, we can decide what kind of process we want to commit ourselves to, not what the outcome will be. So we actually focused on the notion of adverbs. So it was like, what are the adverbs that describe the kind of process of being together that we want? You can see one of the community studios where people come, we invite other community members in to see what's happening. This is sort of, for those of you who are artists, you can kind of see the complexity of doing this. So we have all the little houses are numbered, and we have the shapes cut, and then we are using that to install. So my tips for people are always, start small and aim high. Like, don't do your biggest project the first time you do a project. Build a core group who have high quality skills, consult with local professionals, and then those people then can become part of what builds your project. And here, these are pieces that are sitting here, they're waiting to be installed. But I kind of like this picture where you can see that these are in this neighborhood, and you can see how the color palette of the project really looks like Covington, Kentucky. Here's our plan for installation, and here you can see the final public art piece. And so, one of the big questions in this piece is, will there be a place for me? And the answer being like, yes, yes, you are welcome. There was a lot of controversy in Covington about that time, about a planning process where many people in the Black community felt they had been left out of this planning process. And it really, we had this conversation about when people feel angry about planning processes and changes in urban settings or rural settings for that matter, the question is always, will there be a place for me in this new plan? And that the important answer has to be, yes, yes, you are welcome, you belong here. So I think I'll close with this one other project here, which is called Cannons and Corn, a Garden Community. So I did this piece on the west side of Chicago. Well, it's North Lawndale, but it really is the west side. And it was a mosaic work executed in an intergenerational workshop. So the Chicago Transit Authority rebuilt a number of stations along what was then the blue line, the Chicago Transit Authority blue line. So this is the station, it was already built. And they decided they wanted to have a series of public art in these stations. And it was the middle of winter when they put out the request for proposals. And then, you know, like, yeah, so it was the middle of winter and you had to have like your design in by February or something. And in thinking about this, what I realized is that what I wanted to draw on, because there was no direct community sponsor, but because I do community public art, even for a public art commission, I wanted to figure out what my relationship was to this community. And because I belonged to this group, Chicago Public Art Group, it had long-term connections to this group of gardeners in North Lawndale. And so I decided that I would work on this idea of the theme of this permanent public art project would be the ephemeral public art of the community garden. Now, first I was just really sad because I couldn't go see the community gardens because it was the middle of winter. But then I realized that was a kind of an opportunity because the only way I could see the garden was through the eyes of the gardeners when they would share with me the photographs that they took. So I'm sort of showing you this because just to know that when you're doing a public art project like this, you have to have the design really look like what the final piece is going to be. So that becomes part of it. So here's like the drawing. And then here you can see we're set up at the community workshop. We're using that method of paper to learn how to lay tiles. It was a wonderful intergenerational workshop. And a lot of the work that I've done has been intergenerational. I just think it's really important to reweave connections, to remake connections between people. So the theme of the gardeners was blight to sight. And one of the things I love is the sort of advice that would be in this, which was these old elders talking and saying things like, talk kindly to your plants as if they were people, sort of like taking for granted that when you get on the train to like think about, look, these are people, of course you talk kindly to them. What does it mean to flourish together? Or thinking about their gardener knowledge, which tells us that different plants need different nurturing. And this, by the way, has some pretty complicated tile work in it that was done with a glass saw. And so it combines like the work of community people and also some work from some really myself and some really highly trained assistants who are doing just some pretty exquisite mosaic work. And we deliberately tried to sort of mix up the different styles of the mosaic work. And one of the things I love about this picture is I've had young men say to me, you know, I like mosaics because it's like hard art. And you're like, what? And they're like, you know, it's not like soft, like painting. It's like, it's hard. You've got to like make this thing. You've got to manipulate it. Also kind of bowing to the tradition of Pompeii and other places, and actually to a number of projects that I've done, is this idea of where does trash fit into this image? And the gardeners thought it was hilarious that one of the central images was a dandelion, because of course they're always trying to get rid of dandelions when they're doing community gardens. And here you can see like the teens who were part of this, along with making a piece, then they learned to grout and everything. So the final installation is done with professional tile setters in the train station, but it's important for the students to kind of learn the whole process of this. And one of the cool things then is there's all these little projects that were done by the seniors and done by the teens in the exact same glass that's used in the professional mosaic. And so there's like little satellite mosaics all around the neighborhood. And actually, I think I am going to show you one more. Yeah, I'll just quickly. This is in a public housing project in Chicago called the Hilliard Apartments. And actually, it was designed by Bertrand Goldberg, the same person who designed Marina Towers, which some of you may know, in downtown Chicago. On the edges of downtown, there's also a housing project that he designed it was called Hilliard Homes at the time. So here's like the structure of the Hilliard Homes. The round one are senior buildings, and where that same structure is opened out is the family living. And so part of our project here was working with teens and children and adults. And we basically did work where we learned about Bertrand Goldberg, who was a Bauhaus architect who came to Chicago, along with Mies van der Rohe and some of the other greats of the Bauhaus movement. Of course, Bertrand Goldberg's work so different than Mies van der Rohe, with all the lines and rectangles, that he worked in this sort of organic circular way. So this is a historic housing project, and this is an amphitheater that was part of it. So one of the things we knew is that people didn't use the amphitheater that much because just to sit on the ground. So we wanted to somehow create this intervention in the amphitheater without permanently changing it, because it is a historic site. So we came up with this idea of these seating areas. This place was built between 1963 and 1966. So the thematics of the piece are the texts of Bertrand Goldberg, what he wrote, and then also what happened in those years between 1963 and 1966. What was the spirit of optimism and possibility that led the city of Chicago, the first Mayor Daley, the Mayor Daley who presided over some very reactionary things, to actually approve the idea of this incredibly innovative housing project. So some of the things that happened, the war on poverty, Medicare was begun in those years, Head Start was begun in those years. Changes happened in the immigration policy of the United States. So here we are again, and this housing project actually has a lot of African-American and Chinese seniors living there. So that was like one of the really interesting dynamics. I just put this in because, it's interesting how technology affects us. So this is like the sort of hand-cut mosaics. One of the things that visually works in this is that it's got all these concentric circles, which would be incredibly difficult to do accurately, except that we were able to create a digital template and have these large templates printed out that guided us when we were laying mosaics. And they show up at different points in the mosaic. So the texts in these pieces are all fragments taken from Bertrand Goldberg's writing, an incomplete process with an urgent need. Here you can see we're getting to the end and we're actually installing this, and how this works when we make them on the table. We use a kind of contact paper to hold things together. Once things are installed and the cement is set, then we peel off. This is incredibly time consuming. And here's some of the seniors who are just so excited that they were part of making the pieces, and now they're installing them. This unfinished statement, Goldberg was talking about the unfinished statement of this architecture before the people move in, but also we're thinking of it metaphorically. This is when Johnson signed into law that for the first time in over 50 years did not have racial quotas in American immigration policy. And you can just kind of see, we haven't yet recognized, and these are deliberately done so you kind of have to walk around them to see the picture or to read it, so that you get this idea of circulating through the space, and this design contributed by one of the Chinese seniors. Judge what our idealism has produced. These were the years when, the notion of going into space began and was really beginning to be activated. Or the idea of an incomplete process with an urgent need, the beginning of Head Start. And so you can kind of see here some of the drawings and the way this is made, and then how it becomes something that you see and you find all these details as you circulate through it. So here we are kind of seeing people like sort of aligned with these projects, figuring what's this about, let's look at it, how do we make use of this space just to kind of be together. And this phrase, which I always think is so significant, we can build whatever we think. You know, this is taken from Goldberg's writing. We can build whatever we think. And I like to think that that is like a model of the mural movement, which is we can build whatever we think. So thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you so much, Olivia. I think we're back. We're back being able to see each other, but not other participants. I know that you've said that that you will stay and answer some questions or engage in some conversation. But before you do that, I want to take a moment to thank you for a terrific talk and for sharing such a range of work that you have done over many years, and for showing us in many respects how the act of art making brings people together, or bring people together to, as you said earlier, to begin to recognize their commonality and their shared passions and their shared dreams and their shared struggles. So I very much appreciate your generosity this evening and the range of images that you showed and the range of projects that you shared with us. I'm going to invite those who are here to, if you have some questions, and I know we have some questions already posted, you can either post your questions in the chat, or you can post your questions in the question and answer piece, or the facility within this webinar. As people are beginning to think about and maybe form some questions, I'm wondering if you don't mind talking very briefly, perhaps. As you know, I've seen some of these murals when I visited you in Chicago, and to see them again tonight and to see how you've curated them and how you've brought them together, I'm seeing things that I didn't see obviously when I saw them a few years back. Maybe you might want to talk or not about this idea of both time and text. And what struck me was that, you know, that several of the murals are recording time, or they're representing time, or they're capturing time passing, or they're projecting into a time yet to come. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'm thinking of Boris Groy's notion that, you know, that artworks in a way are almost like, within the Christian tradition, they're almost like Christ. They never die, you know, that they're preserved over and over, particularly artworks in museums and artworks that curators spend a lot of their time working with. I'm kind of curious if you have maybe some thoughts about the mural as a living work and as a work that changes over time, and that perhaps that changes over time, both in a material way, but also maybe in a conceptual way. So that was one thing that struck me. The other thing that struck me tonight was the way in which you use text, and how text becomes this companion with the image, and how text provokes the viewer. So I'm just putting those out there if you want to pick up any of them.
Yeah, and that's clearly something that I've thought a lot about. I mean, going back to that, the piece that I did on the street, where we're recording people and then putting the text on the sidewalk. And that, I think, was around, I mean, partly it really comes out of my reading of Paulo Freire, which I started to read when I was a young teacher. A priest who had been in Latin America brought that book back, brought that book back to me. And certainly when you talk about things, situating something within a Christian tradition, I mean, that's certainly my background. And also, I mean, Freire, though he never talks about Christianity, if you look at the metaphors of that work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's very much based in sort of a biblical notion of metaphor and symbolism. And one of the things that Freire says that has resonated with me for many years is that no one can say a true word alone. So it really caused me to reflect on this idea that my role as an artist is not just to come up with individual new things and tell people, you know, show people, but that part of my role is to actually hold that notion of the authenticity and even the specialness of certain kinds of insights, not so much inside of me, but sort of like, in a sense, right outside of me, like in the space that's created between myself and others. And so I think for me, it really trained me in the concept of listening to people and to really believe. I mean, I was inspired by some of the work of people who do community arts oral history, But many years ago, I started to talk about calling it oral theory, because it's not just people telling stories, it's people making sense of their lives by how they formulate the stories, by what they remember and what they tell, by what they bring forward. So that's been a really important thing for me, this notion of text. And as I say, when I did that unemployment line forms, that's where the notion of like the poetry of everyday language became really important to me. That you listen, that you can learn to listen, and in doing that, working with others, you can help others learn to listen to the subtlety of the way in which people say things, and how sometimes those little insights can actually open up like a whole other way of thinking about the world. So that's definitely there. I hadn't thought as much about the idea of time, but it really makes, I can count on you, Donald, to come up with some fresh, sophisticated ways of having me think about this. And I'll definitely reflect on that more. And I know that like there's a number of murals I've done have the passage of time through the year, show up in different ways. Actually, that one mural I did, Where We Come From, Where We're Going, has been mentioned by many people as the only mural they know of where people are wearing coats, where it's actually not, like always summer outside here, but they're actually, it reflects the time when I stood on the street and made that. And then, it becomes part of this notion of what does it mean to like physically be in a space. So I'll have to think about that more, because it's true. It does both think about the past, but it also speculates on a possible future. So thank you for that insight.
Not at all. I think it was the way in which you curated your images tonight that somehow that came forward.
Yeah.
You've been speaking for a long time, so we do have a question that I think that you've covered in part during your presentation, but I will pose it because it was asked here. And the question really is about the practice of making murals. And I think there's a recognition that every mural project is different and particular and responsive, and there's a context that surrounds each and every one of these murals. Are there certain things that you carry across your practice? So are there certain, I don't want to call them essential steps, but are there a kind of certain principles that are dear to you and that are important for the actualization of the mural? And I know a lot about your work to know that, as you said earlier, listening and a commitment to community and a commitment to the voices of many are things that you carry through a lot of your work, both your written work, your lecture work, your teaching work, and so forth. But the question that came in is, do you want to talk a bit more about the planning process that kind of carries across different, that you carry with you, knowing that every mural project is a different project?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Every project is different and it comes about in different ways. So like that one that I showed you, which is the CTA station with the gardeners. I mean, I tried to really sort of mention, when you do these public art projects, they put out a request for proposals. You have to, and mostly what people do, this is like really sad about public art in much of the States, is that then people have to come up with a design and then you get design chosen for that design and it happens. And maybe some people in the community are empowered to vote on which of 3 artists, et cetera. But one of the things that I, always try to do when things like that come up is how do I tweak the project, change the project, so I get involved with some community people from the beginning when the design is done. So that's always really important to me. I would say that one thing that's really important is that I try to defer settling on a theme early in the project. Like I try to not be, this is what this project is about. Like when I went out to DeKalb, I had no idea what this project was about. And, years ago, I used to kind of make up in the back of my mind this idea of what the theme could be in case nobody came up with an idea. But I don't do that anymore because I now always trust people will come up with something much more interesting. And so, and also, that you just have to be committed to being there together as long as it takes to come to this sense of what you want to investigate. So I think there's that, like if you see there's a number, I showed you 3 murals, but I've done other projects too that are about the issue of race. And my thing is, this might sound like an odd thing to say, but I've never been interested in making a mural which is be anti-racist. because I sort of take for granted that that's what people should be. So the question becomes, how do you investigate this idea of how race operates within various communities? You know, how does the project, let's say the Rosalind Pullman, you know, which is, how do you think about the fact that there's this division between these communities? How do you bring it together on a border? And there I was really operating on the sort of Freirean notion that, you know, Freire says that, you know, there is this idea of what people think of as what's possible, and then the limits of what's possible. And what he says is that where you reach that limit, that border, is not where possibility ends, it's where possibility begins. You go to, you make what, you know, he calls a limit action. You go to that limit and you make a limit action. So that was, I think, a time when we took quite literally the notion of Freire saying the limit action is that we will figure out how to create the organization to bring people together when there is no community organizations that are doing that. There are no community organizations doing that at this point. How do we make that happen here? So there's this idea. So that comes back to this idea too of how do you decide, how do you come up with actions that somehow embody? So when we did that Mifflin mural, it was all about the potlucks, you know, as we start doing that and start learning about like food chains and things as part of that. I did a mural in a church once. The church really dedicated to homeless service. And one of the images of the mural is a really big foot that's being washed. And we actually did foot washing as part of the community activities of that. You know, it's something that the church did on Good Friday. And we did that as part of our work in making the mural, to really think about this idea of the humility of washing someone's feet, the care and humility. And I like to think that those kinds of activities also infuse then the energy of the group. So if that's kind of, you know, to try to have these times where you come together in a kind of peaceful, reflective mode. So that's part of it. The other thing, I showed that very first image where there's like all this kind of pasted together drawing. And, you know, again, that's different aspects of the drawing developed by different people. I try to use the principle that everybody has creative spirit. Some people can draw, some people can't, but sometimes people can come up with incredibly poetic image ideas, and then it's left to someone else who, quotes, can draw to, you know, to maybe manifest that. So to try to find that everybody has this sort of spiritual creative contribution is part of the work. And then, as I say, at some point, you know, you make that drawing, and then, you know, there's the whole technical aspect of getting it made. And I did kind of notice the person asking that question. I work in acrylic paint, usually like doing things like enamel paint and stuff. Don't do that. It's really bad for bricks. It's really bad for walls. Thinking about acrylic paint, it's actually also sort of breathable. I mean, actually water does seep through acrylic paint, you know, at a very slow rate, which means then that it's not going to like pop the surface off the bricks. So we use acrylic paint. We use a pure acrylic in the sense it's an acrylic gesso, acrylic paint, acrylic sealer, and those seem to have held up pretty well. I have murals that are like that Mifflin mural now is more than 30 years old. And we were just talking to people right before the pandemic about the possibility of, you know, coming up to restore it. And the people who had, the co-op had actually closed, in a community healthcare organization had bought the building. And they said when they bought the building, the people said, yeah, it'll be good for 20 years. And they're like, hey, it's over 30 years and it's still in pretty good shape. So, you know, we feel happy and proud about that. Whatever you do, don't paint murals with cheap paint, because they don't last and they end up having the opposite of what you want the meaning of the mural to be. You know what I mean? The meaning ends up becomes like the inability of communities to sustain themselves and to do high quality things. And so it's just like, if the money isn't there to really clean the wall, do some sort of temporary piece, but don't paint with cheap paint. So that's my advice, you know? Right.
Well, thank you so much, Olivia. I think there's probably a paper to be written about this. I guess with a lot of the new writing around new materialism, there's something really lovely about what you've spoken about, is paying attention to the materials that you use, but also the surfaces onto which you will apply those materials, and then to think about the interaction between those two surfaces. I see that we have one more question, I think, that came in, or I think it's an expression of deep appreciation for going through that question in great detail and great depth. I noticed that we're almost at 7 p.m.
Right.
I think we kept you like longer than we asked you to give. So thank you so much for your generosity. It's always good to see and to hear you and to follow your work and to be given an insight into how you think and how you actualize that thinking. And I think tonight you did a beautiful job, for me at least, in terms of showing the work, but also revealing your thinking process, your making process, and also your commitment to community. So I want to say on behalf of my colleagues in art education, but also my colleagues in the School of Art and all of the students who joined the talk, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to say thank you and a good evening, I guess, but thank you so much.
I'd like to say that, I've done some work in the last year with Angela Laporte. I was so excited to hear that you were going to Arkansas and being, in, the general area of the country that I'm in. And I am really excited about what's happening in art education at University of Arkansas. So as I told you, I had actually just visited in Bentonville for a whole week a couple of years ago and look forward to many more visits because I think some exciting things are happening there in art education. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.